Mr. Speaker, defense spending was $348 billion in 2002. Now it is well over $600 billion a year, and this total does not include the military construction budget, which has totaled more than $181 billion over the last 10 years, and many billions more in supplemental appropriations. There is presently a request for another $30 billion supplemental appropriations for the military. On top of all this, almost every year for the 29 years I've been here, there's been an end-of-the-year omnibus appropriations bill, which always contains even more for the Defense Department. I've always believed that national defense is one of the most important, most legitimate functions of the federal government, but I'm also a fiscal conservative. With our nation $20 trillion in debt and many trillions more in unfunded future Social Security and pension liabilities in the years ahead, we desperately need some fiscal conservatives in the Pentagon. I realize that the easiest thing in the world to do is to spend other people's money, and you can never satisfy any government's appetite for money or land. They always want more. But it is a myth to say or think that the Defense Department is underfunded when defense spending has doubled since 2002. Yet even though this spending has gone way up, most people around the country seem to believe it has gone way down. We hear some saying the military has been decimated or has undergone drastic cuts. This has been a masterful public relations job, I assume, by the Pentagon working with defense contractors and think tanks funded by the defense industry. Last year we spent $177.5 billion for new equipment, tanks, planes, weapons of all sorts. Most of this equipment does not wear out after just 1 year. Yet we keep spending similar amounts on new equipment every year. I mentioned that the military construction funds are in a separate bill, not in the regular Defense Department appropriations bill. The $181 billion we have appropriated over the last 10 years in this bill means you probably cannot find any military base in the world without new construction going on, and much more that is only 3 or 4 years old or even newer. We have a $20 trillion national debt. Last week I read in the Washington Times that the estimate now is that we will be $91 trillion in debt 30 years from now. Obviously, if we allow that much debt, we will be printing so much money that our Social Security, military, and civil service pensions will be worth very little. In the biography Bonhoeffer about the famous theologian by Eric Metaxas, it says that in 1921 the currency exchange rate was 75 German marks to the dollar. The next year it was 400 marks to the dollar. Then inflation really took off, and by early 1923 it was 7,000 to 1. Metaxas wrote, quote, "The resultant economic turmoil would make the bleak conditions of a few months earlier look like the good old days. By August, a dollar was worth 1 million marks. The book says by the end of 1923 things had become impossible. In October, Dietrich wrote that every meal cost 1 billion marks. Germany in the early 1920s was one of the most educated countries in the world. It is hard to imagine what could happen here in the United States if we continue to spend money we do not have and run trillions more into debt. With the exception of a brief downturn in 1958, President Eisenhower gave the nation 8 years of peace and prosperity and balanced budgets, and he looks better with the passage of time. He spent most of his career in the military and loved and respected that institution. But in a new book called Ike's Bluff by Evan Thomas is this very interesting observation. Quote, "Eisenhower was in effect his own Secretary of Defense. When Defense Secretary Neil McElroy warned him that further budget cuts could harm national security, Eisenhower acerbically replied, 'If you go to any military installation in the world where the American flag is flying and tell the commander that Ike says he'll give him an extra star for his shoulder if he cuts his budget, there'll be such a rush to cut costs that you'll have to get out of the way.' He would periodically cite to Andy Goodpaster, his chief of staff, 'God help the nation when it has a president who doesn't know as much about the military as I do.' As we all know, Eisenhower made a famous statement in his farewell address warning against the excesses of the military-industrial complex. I think, Mr. Speaker, he would be shocked at how far we have gone down that road against which he